Well, good morning. A few years back, Becky and I took our kids to Anza Borrego Desert State Park. I don't know if you've been there, but it's California's biggest state park. It's 600,000 acres in the desert east of San Diego, and it's a dark sky location. So it's perfect for stargazing because there's very little, natural or artificial light. So we got a blanket, we spread it out on the desert floor, and we looked up. Because the general rule is that the darker the sky, the brighter the stars. And the same is true with the spiritual environment. The darker the conditions around us, the brighter are the promises of God to his people. And some of us here can use some fresh hope because hope sometimes gets a little hollow as we look around in the darkness with the international crises and political division and so much social chaos and various forms and diagnoses of soul sickness that we see all over the place. And so the question is, when and where can we find fresh hope? And the answer is Advent. This is the season where we get fresh hope after hope maybe has been kind of sucked into a black hole of chronically bad news. And the book of Isaiah gives us reasons for hope. Isaiah gives us a whole constellation of bright star passages, and the brightest of which are these prophecies about the coming of a mysterious person to rescue God's willing people. So there's hope. There's hope for you, there's hope for me, and even as we'll see, there's hope for the world as a whole. So this month we're going to look at 4 passages about this mysterious person in our Ashes to Advent series. Today we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 6 and also John 12 as we prepare for the Lord's Supper. Today's takeaway is very simple. It's this: to regain hope this Advent season, let's get an Isaiah-sized view of God. All December, let's seek an Isaiah-inspired perspective on God himself as we read Isaiah's prophecy. And that means seeing God in all of his frightful but gracious immensity, his bigness. And so today we're going to talk about personal hope. We're going to talk about hope for the world, like panoramic hope, and we're going to talk about how this hope will come. So we're going to start in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, which says, in the year that King Uzziah died, and we'll just take a quick pause right here to set the scene. King Uzziah lived in the 8th century before Christ, and the southern kingdom of Judah at this time had been powerful and prosperous, at least for some. But the rich were flaunting their wealth, including their jewels, which Isaiah talks about, and their fancy clothing, while seizing the land of the poor. And they were leaving the temple where they'd been offering their ritualistic sacrifices and praises, and then going off to their secret gardens and worshiping idols called the oaks in Isaiah chapter 129, these non-gods that they were really secretly worshiping to meet their needs. And so on the outside, the nation looked healthy, but on the inside, they were a mess. And Isaiah chapter 1, verses 5 through 6 says, "Why will you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint." So they were dangerously ill, and yet denying their need for repentance and forgiveness and healing. Well, back in June, I was taking a run near my dad's house in Sacramento, and I tripped over a curb that I didn't see, and I broke both my wrist and my elbow. And it hurt a lot, and I couldn't move it well, but I thought to myself, this delusional thinking, it's probably just sprained. And I can probably just continue on my run, even though it was kind of hanging funny, and it hurt, and it was fairly obvious something was wrong, but I denied it. And this is a little bit like what Judah was doing, denying their brokenness. As the advancing Assyrians were breaking off territory, that the Lord had given them on condition of faithfulness. So, speaking of ashes, our series is Ashes to Advent. Verse 7, chapter 1, your country lies desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. In your very presence, foreigners devour your land. So, God is going to put merciful pressure on his people to remember the covenant, and pressure in the form of foreign invasion. Because God is committed to his covenant people, and the reasons why he raised Abraham and his descendants in the first place to be a blessing to the world that had gotten sin sick, so that his forgiveness and his healing would fill the earth. So God raises up a prophet to bring his Abrahamic people back to spiritual health and service. Isaiah, known as the Prince of the Prophets. But this prophet himself has a big problem. Back to verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. Just remember that phrase. And the train of his robe filled the temple. So the heavenly throne room is open, and Isaiah sees the one who is generally unseeable. And what does he see? Well, he sees God on a throne. So God is a king, and a king like any other, very alive, unlike Uzziah, who is or who will soon be dead. But then notice this again. Notice that Isaiah sees that he's high, and he's lifted up. So high that Isaiah only sees the train of his robe, just the lower part of Yahweh's garment, which indicates how exalted, again, how high and lifted up God is. And then verse 2 gives us a few more details. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. So he sees these like winged-looking serpents, these flaming angels, and out of deep reverence, they're covering their faces. In verse 3, it tells us what they're doing. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And I know you know what this word holy means. It means separate, set apart from human impurity and weakness and sin. It's really a word that means unlike any other. And for those of you, maybe in school, you learned the Latin phrase sui generis, meaning in a class by himself. Well, Yahweh is sui generis times 3 because he's holy, holy, holy. And this triple use of holy, it elevates Yahweh's incomparability to the highest possible degree. And notice too that he's described as Yahweh of hosts. He's literally Yahweh of the heavenly armies, meaning Yahweh of all power and wisdom in accomplishing his wise purposes. He is unstoppable, just full of force, and as we'll see, foresight. And finally, notice the seraphim call out that the whole earth is filled with his glory. And I know you know that word. Well, it has a couple of different nuances here. First, it's a way of saying that the earth abundance reflects God's goodness to us. And I was thinking as Dumer led us in Dave Reuter's memorial service for the beauty of the earth, hill and vale and tree and flower, that the earth itself in its abundance tells us about God's generous glory. Well, the second idea behind glory here is the idea of honor and esteem. In fact, the root idea is heaviness. In fact, you'll find this interesting. The word for glory in a slightly different form is the same word for the word liver, because the liver is the heaviest organ in the body. So to the seraphim, Yahweh is holy and he's heavy. He is the most substantial, important reality, constantly commanding the esteem and the adoration of myriad of angels. And he's heavy to us. the believers of the Valley Church. Who he is and what he says is of the utmost importance to us. And maybe like the seraphim, we should all be thinking or maybe whispering all day long, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is filled with his glory because he's so awesome and other and yet so generous. He's heavy in our estimation. But to most of Isaiah's countrymen, Yahweh wasn't heavy, he was light. He wasn't an important matter to them, and they were sick as a result. So Yahweh's going to have to shake them up. But first, he's going to have to shake up his prophet the way verse 4 says that the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Well, let's reflect on this for a minute here. You know, as one person said, God, the great king, isn't mean, but he is dangerous. Like any great force, like electricity, for example. In fact, a couple weeks ago, Becky and I were changing a light bulb in the kids' bathroom. And I know what you're thinking, you needed 2 people for this job. And I say yes, because first, I don't count in maintenance situations like that. So it's really just one. And usually I'm standing there in repair settings like a seraph, admiring Becky's capacity to do it. But you know, I could have handled this one by myself, but there was a complication because even when the light switch was off, the light bulb was still flickering. The switch is kind of old and worn out. So before we messed with the bulb, we had enough sense to go to the garage and turn off all the breakers. Not because electricity is mean, but because electricity is dangerous. And that's really the attitude that we should have towards God. Heaviness. He's important. He's not mean, but he's holy. And so the Israelites in Isaiah's day were not treating God with heaviness, and because of that, they will get shocked. But it's to bring them back to health. Verse 5 gives us Isaiah's reaction to this healthy shock that he gets. And I said, woe is me. For I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Isaiah is now brutally aware of himself after just the briefest glimpse of the moral perfection aspect of Yahweh's holiness. And woe, it's an interjection. And it's really it's like a guttural response to his own recognition of his own sinful condition. And so he cries out in despair in the presence of the one who is ethically pure and absolutely upright and utterly true. And he blurts out this, he says, I'm lost. I'm ruined. You know, when I hurt my arm that day, it was kind of hanging there. And like I said, I went to urgent care and I kept telling the nurse, it's probably just sprained. It's probably just sprained. And then finally they brought back the x-rays to show me the fractures, to show me that it was broken. And at that time, it was lost to me. It was useless, but it was certainly not worthless. It was worth a ton to me. Well, this is with Isaiah here, God will show him the spiritual x-ray, showing him his unclean lips, and lips represents his whole person. And he sees his sin-sick condition, and he's not alone. It's an epidemic of all humanity. Here's how one person put it. Few today have discovered that they have been disastrously wrong and that they cannot change or escape the consequences of it on their own. But that's where personal hope starts, with hopelessness about our inborn spiritual condition. And most of us, my brothers and sisters in this room, we have been graced with the recognition, I once was lost. You ask Ben too. Ben will say, I once was lost. But God opened our eyes, God opened Ben's eyes to our deep need for cleansing and repair, and that's why we're here to worship. If we had stayed on the throne of our own little universe denying our need, there would be no hope of recovery from our lost and sinful condition. But listen to this here. Yahweh doesn't argue with Isaiah because he agrees. But catch this. Yahweh's actions show Isaiah both his woefulness and his worthfulness. Chapter 6, verse 6, then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for. You know, in one forgiving gesture, Yahweh shows Isaiah both his woefulness and his worthfulness. Again, we humans, we're not just lost. We're lost treasures to the one who made us. And this might surprise you. But Yahweh should be heavy to humans. But you know what the Bible says? It says that humans are actually heavy to Yahweh. He says this in 43, verse 4. It says, you are precious in my eyes and honored, literally heavy. We're important to God. He put his image on us. He has a role for us in this world. So we're heavy to Yahweh, even though we treat him light. As the words that Debbie just led us in, O holy night, long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared, and the soul felt its worth. So in undeserved generosity, God, the high and heavy king, does for the prophet what he couldn't do for himself, and what he aims to do for the nation. The offended one offers forgiveness, cleansing, and healing. In a word, grace. And most of us in this room, our personal hope for the future means just remembering that our own sin has been forgiven, covered over, and blotted out by the God who is holy, 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 and whose glory fills the earth. My sin, not in part, but the whole. And if you're visiting here this morning, maybe this vision from Isaiah is helping you to see, yes, I am lost, and I need the forgiveness that the people in this room enjoy, and the cleansing and the healing that I can only get from my Creator. And this experience launches Isaiah, this experience of cleansing, on a 60-year journey of service with seraphim-like dedication. Well, most messages in Isaiah 6, they end here because it's such a great spot. But we actually have to finish the chapter because the second half, even though it's a little confusing, is just as significant for gaining deep hope in dark sky times. So look at this. This will show us, even though it seems dim at first, that there's hope for the world. Check this out. Verse 8, and I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And then I said, here I am, send me. So Isaiah goes from woe is me to look at me. That's literally what behold means. There's look at me. And he has nothing more to hide. His heart's been cleansed and he's volunteering for service. And then Yahweh gives him his mission of preaching and writing down God's words. But listen to what Yahweh says about how successful Isaiah's ministry will be, at least from a human perspective. Verse 10, Isaiah, make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. In other words, Isaiah, you're going to preach, but they're not going to listen. Because I'm going to put a hard shell around their hard hearts. And then Isaiah asks, how long, O Lord? And Yahweh responds, verse 11b, until cities lie waste without inhabitants, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste. In other words, until the people of Judah are shocked, until they're taken 500 miles to the east in Babylon. And honestly, this doesn't sound like a bright star, right? This kind of sounds like a black hole. But it is a bright star. Because this is part of God's merciful plan to bring hope and healing to the nations and even to the cosmos itself. Because as Isaiah foresaw, 150 years after this vision, In 587 BC, long after Isaiah had gone to be with the Lord, the Babylonians rolled in. And they reduced Judah to ashes. But for an ultimately merciful, even adventful purpose. In Isaiah, in our passage, he prophesied about the Babylonian invasion and its aftermath in this really intriguing verse 13, which seems at first like a black hole. Listen to this. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. Well, that's the end, right? We just have a burned out tree. But wait a minute, there is something left. There's a stump fixed in the ground. Everything else is burned, but there's this little stump that's sticking up. In fact, speaking of stumps, you remember a year ago or so, we had this big tree out in between Building 2 and Building 3 in the Activity Center. And remember how this beautiful tree, it was just making a mess of the pavement, making it easy for people to trip and break their arms, right? So Matt finally had to take it out. And I remember the day the Babylonians came in their chariot truck and they sawed it down. In fact, Matt even reminded me of this. He said, yeah, and one of the guys even took his chainsaw and chainsawed his initials into the stump. And then a week later, another guy from the same crew brought the stump grinder. And he just pulverized that stump into nothing but sawdust. And they bagged it up and they took it away. And then Matt, he's not a Babylonian, but Matt, he paved it over. You have no idea there had been a tree there. Well, that's not the situation here because Yahweh of hosts preserved a stump. And the stump is a seed. Yeah, Judah gets sacked, but a few people, a stump remains. And even 2 Kings will report kind of offhandedly that the captain of the Babylonian guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. Well, this stump is a holy seed. So the question is, can a plant burst forth from a little burned stump? Can Advent and hope come from ashes? Yes, because of Yahweh of hosts, the one of unstoppable force and foresight, always knowing the end from the beginning, always working out his perfect purposes. Let's see from Isaiah's writings here, little hints of what will come in the weeks ahead. Isaiah 11:1, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. There's hope. There's hope from a burned out stump. Do you have a burned out life? Could there be hope from the ashes you're presently sitting in? Well, look, it's just a twig, right? But notice this mysterious shoot from a seed is a royal person. And next week, Pastor Kurt is going to talk about what Isaiah wrote about this child in chapter 9. But what's going on here? Well, just to give you the big view, what's the theme of Isaiah's 66-chapter book? It's this, it's hope for the world. Because Isaiah will continue to write for the next 60 years these vivid pictures of restoration and regrowth of the people. But prophecies of this diverse but cohesive people, offspring, Judah and Israel and foreigners that have joined the group, returning to Zion. Healed servants with hearts throbbing with joy, tears wiped away, stable in faith, no longer worshiping oaks, but Isaiah says, stable in faith like oaks, oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord that he may be glorified. And Isaiah goes on. He depicts these returnees as eating rich food and drink and enjoying material prosperity and receiving the wealth of the nations in walls rebuilt, inlaid with precious stones. And pictures of comfort imaged as a husband marrying a wife and of a mother embracing her son. And images of nature itself renewed to a Garden of Eden-like condition with children reaching into cobra dens in the desert and wolves and lambs lying down together, and images of international harmony with humbled nations melting down their swords and walking shoulder to shoulder into Yahweh's city and temple. I mean, Isaiah pictures the whole world purged of idols and harmonious, with the glory of Yahweh encompassing everything as a canopy. And only the disobedience and the God disbelievers on the outside of this circle of happiness. And I know this sounds too good to be true, but that's a picture of what Isaiah wrote about the true future for Yahweh's servants, even us. At the end of the book, the very end, he talks about a restoration so great, eternal life, joy so complete, health so strong, literally talks about bones, healthy bones, right? He says this in Isaiah 66, "For as the new heavens and the new earth that I make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your offspring, your seed, remain." So somehow, by the end of this book, this little Isaiah 6 stump seed that sprouted will become a shoot that became a slender tree that multiplied into an oak forest of faithful people in an eternal new creation. But how's this going to happen? How are we going to go from burned out stump to a forest of oaks and a renewed creation? How's that going to happen? And the answer is this. This miracle of transformation will occur through the ministry of Isaiah's mysterious person. A radically different kind of leader, a king-like servant and servant-like king who will be Yahweh's treasured instrument to accomplish this restoration. And listen to this. This will amaze you maybe. Isaiah 52:12 will describe this king-like servant and servant-like king in familiar terms. Listen, behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up. Where have we heard that phrase before? And he'll go on. He'll just describe this servant, a leader like no other leader who will be gentle. He won't even break off a reed that is bent over. And he's going to be merciful. He'll open the eyes of the blind and be a light for the nations. And he'll deliver people from prison while speaking the most powerful words ever heard by human ears. And Isaiah prophesied that this one would be honored in the eyes of Yahweh, but ironically, he would be deeply despised and even abhorred by Yahweh's nation. This servant-like king and king-like servant will enable this mass cleansing and return through intense personal suffering by willingly serving as a sin offering on behalf of others through the glory of his self-giving, generous love. So yes, Isaiah says that the servant will be high and lifted up, just like Yahweh, right? By being low and lifted down. But after this shameful treatment and extreme suffering, Yahweh's servant would not be put to shame ultimately, but rather vindicated. Well, was Isaiah's prophecy fulfilled? The people did return to the land, just like Isaiah said they would 70 years later. But the restoration didn't look quite like the prophet had pictured. Reality didn't seem to match the prophetic image. They did rebuild the temple, smaller version. But where was the canopy of glory? And where was the political independence? Where was the material prosperity? Foreigners, rather than worshiping with them, were dominating them. Well, in the first century, the people were just as perplexed, and even the rabbis were lamenting, saying that maybe God shouldn't even have made humans because the gloom was so palpable. It was just an incredibly dark time. And then, one day, 700 years after Isaiah wrote about a seed in the line of David, in Yahweh's mysterious person, a baby was born in the town of Bethlehem, a shoot from the stump of Jesse. And this shoot grew up and opened the eyes of the blind and performed deeds that only Yahweh could do, like stilling storms and feeding the masses, signs that resembled the deeds of Yahweh himself. when he delivered the children of Israel from Egypt. And this one, he spoke words never before heard, words that sustained the weary, as Isaiah 50 said. And some believed. And this one gathered a ragtag group of disciples and people like Mary and Martha and Lazarus. But many continued to reject. In fact, John 12:37 says, though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him. And then at Passover, this servant king, he rode into Jerusalem with the Pharisees still opposing him, even after he had raised Lazarus from the dead. And they tell Jesus, say, hey, Jesus, these Greeks, these people from the foreign nations to whom God's servant would be a light, as Isaiah said, they've asked to see Jesus. They want to see you, Jesus. And Jesus said this, he said, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. It's one of our big words. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat, that's a seed, right, falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. So as Isaiah predicted, and as John confirmed, this servant king was in fact deeply despised and abhorred and rejected by his own people. And he gave his back to those who would strike. And John confirms all of Isaiah's prophecy, saying that Jesus was flogged and struck with hands and dishonored with mockery. Hail, King of the Jews! And scorned by the crowds who cried out, away with him, just like Isaiah had predicted. Finally, he was nailed to a cross. He was pierced for our transgressions, and Jesus didn't raise a voice. He didn't fight the way the world fights. He just persisted in his mission. And we see here that God's servant would indeed be high and lifted up. And listen to what Jesus himself said. He said, and when I am lifted up from the earth, meaning lifted on a cross, I will draw all people to myself. He would lay down his life. He would be the seed that would be destroyed in death when he was crucified and laid in that dark tomb. But we know the story. That seed didn't remain underground. The seed sprang up because God raised his servant. And in resurrection strength, Jesus, he appeared to Mary Magdalene, and then he appeared to the disciples. And his first words were, peace be with you. And then, in an echo of Yahweh's commission to Isaiah, Jesus said, as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. And this news, it has spread. And now Jesus' spiritual seed, his spiritual offspring, not physical offspring, but spiritual descendants who accepted his atoning sacrifice, becoming cleansed servants themselves, are in the billions. And the number is growing. The forest of oaks of righteousness is growing from every nation. You know, and one final shocker, astonishing thing as we take communion is this. In John 12:41, John writes this. He says, Isaiah said these things because he saw his, meaning Jesus' glory, and spoke of him. We're just come full circle. John writes that Isaiah was seeing the glory of Jesus himself, the shared glory of Father and Son. Because Jesus on the cross, high and lifted up, is the truest revelation of the glory of Yahweh, surrounded by blazing seraphim. That's the true glory of God, that God himself would return, as Isaiah wrote, in the person of his Son, the king-like servant and servant-like king, to bear our sin and to press a burning coal of forgiveness onto the souls of all people who say, woe is me. I need his cleansing and forgiveness. They get their sin covered, and that's the true glory, that's the generous glory of God.